Like, it has like waterfalls and stuff. Was it at the university? And so is it like this? Was it, because I heard my friend lived there, and there weren't that many Muslims. But are there a lot of that?
There's a lot of students, especially student population.
So you went to Cornell?
Then I went to Adams, then I went to Adams Center in DC.
That's where I live. When did that? When is it?
Literally last Sunday. So when I was there,
Did you talk in the kahwa? Or
it was meant to be in Kahwa, but so many people signed up, they moved it to the mosque.
That's good for you. I did a talk in kahwa. They didn't need to move it.
So yeah, when I got there, I said I'm coming to London to do an interview. They were like,
Yeah, that's too bad. I would have liked to invite you to our house.
and then from there I went to NYU.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And then I went to New Jersey.
Inshallah, I hope you're all well in this lovely evening, inshallah, with our dear guests. Inshallah, before we begin tonight's program, we will begin with recitation of the Quran, inshallah. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنما المؤمنون إخوة فأصلحوا بين أخويكم واتقوا الله لعلكم ترحمون يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكن خيرا منهن ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب بئس الاسم الفسوق بعد الإيمان ومن لم يتب فأولئك هم الظالمون يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا أيحب أحدكم أن يأكل لحم أخيه ميتا فكرهتموه واتقوا الله إن الله تواب رحيم يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in the Quran in Surah Al-Hujurat that indeed the believers are but brothers, so make assessment between your brothers and fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you may receive mercy. Oh, you have believed, let not a people ridicule other people, perhaps they may be better than them. Nor let women ridicule other women, because perhaps they may be better than them. And do not insult one another, and do not call each other by nicknames. Indeed, wretched is the name of disobedience after one's faith. And whoever does not repent, then it is those who are the wrongdoers. O you have believed, avoid much negative assumption, because indeed some assumption is sinful. And do not spy and do not backbite each other. Would one of you like to eat the flesh of his brother when he has died? You detest it. And fear Allah, indeed Allah is a acceptor of repentance and merciful. O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female, and we made you from peoples and tribes, so that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is knowing and acquainted. On behalf of SOAS Islamic Society, I welcome all of you, my dear brothers and sisters, from all tribes and from all peoples, to this blessed night, to tonight's talk here with our esteemed guests, who I hope, inshallah, will be leaving you not only with knowledge this evening, but with hope. And I'd like to introduce first our guest, Habeeb Akande, who was born in London, England, and graduated from Kingston University with a first class honours degree in business and film studies. After his graduation, Habib travelled to Egypt, where he studied Islamic studies, He studied Arabic, Islamic law, and Islamic history at Al-Azhar University, which is a very prestigious university in Egypt, and internationally for Muslims across the world. Next, I welcome to this team Professor Jonathan A.C. Brown, who is Associate Professor and Chair of Islamic Civilization at Georgetown University in America. He is the Editor-in-Chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam and Law, and the author of several books, including Misquoting Muhammad, The Challenges and Choices of Interpreting the Prophet's Legacy. And a reminder, if you're not already aware, that he's also published a new book, Islam and Blackness, which will also be on sale today outside the hall, inshallah, on the way out. Last but not least, our dear Ustadh Mustafa Briggs, who seems in last November loved us so much that he's come back for seconds. Alhamdulillah, he's a graduate of Arabic and International Relations from the University of Westminster. His dissertation focused on Arabic literature and literacy in West Africa. He started an MA in translation at SOAS with specialization in Arabic and Islamic texts, before going on to Al-Azhar in Cairo, Egypt, where he's currently doing another degree in Islamic Studies and Arabic. He wrote to international acclaim for his book, Beyond Bilal, which is also on sale today outside, which is a lecture series which is going to explore and uncover the deep-rooted relation between Islam and Black history and the legacy of contemporary African Muslim scholarship and its role in the international Muslim world, as well as the vital role female scholarship played in West Africa, in the West African Islamic tradition, which he presented at over 30 universities across 3 continents, including Oxford, Cambridge, and Yale, Harvard and Yale. Mustafa has also been featured on international media such as Al Jazeera and Islam Channel to discuss themes such as Islamic history and Blackness in Islam, and is also currently working on forthcoming translation of traditional West African Islamic texts. Inshallah, I'll now hand over to our dear guest Habib to take over the rest of the evening, so please do sit back and enjoy, and thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Some energy.
Wa alaikum salam.
Okay, before I start, after praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I want to thank SOAS, the SOAS ISOC, Creamer Foundation, and IHRC, the Islamic Human Rights Commission, for inviting me to chair this wonderful event. Again, before I get into, I wanted to kind of do a formal introduction, but my brother, mashallah, has done an introduction for 2 esteemed guests. The 2 books, Islam and Blackness and Beyond Bilal, I'd highly recommend each and every one of you to purchase a copy. Well, I'd highly recommend you to purchase 2 copies, one for yourself and one you can give to a friend or a loved one, given that it's Valentine's Day tomorrow. But yeah, in all seriousness, a very highly recommended book. I've had the pleasure of reading 2 or 3, the book at least 2 or 3 times, and again, I highly recommend it not only for ourselves but also for anyone who has any doubts about Islam, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim or even Black or non-Black. It's both exceptional reason. Again, I highly recommend each and every one of you to purchase at least 2 copies. But after that spiel, I kind of want to try and make this a bit more interactive. So rather than our 2 esteemed guests giving formal presentations, I want to ask a couple of questions for maybe like about half an hour to 45 minutes. And then we'll have a Q&A. But if anyone wants to ask a question, again, when we get to the Q&A, you can formally raise your hand. Alternatively, we've got a QR code, which, is it going to go up?
Yeah, it's going to go up.
Okay, it's going to go up shortly. And then obviously you can add or send your questions via the Q&A. But before we get into that, do you mind, I want to ask each of the authors if you can read a short excerpt from your book, and then I'll start asking some questions if that's okay. So we'll start with Age Before Beauty. So Professor Brown.
Can we go with beauty before age? That might be a better.
Or beauty before age.
Yeah, 'cause age needs to find section.
In deep thought.
You're going first.
Oh, okay.
No, wait, beauty I said, right? I'm older than you.
No problem, no problem.
Yeah. How old are you? Oh, you're okay. Never mind. You're younger than me.
Okay, Bismillah. So I'll read just to give an introduction to the actual book and the reason why I wrote the book and what I speak about in the book. I'll read, inshallah, the foreword. So after saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, As-salatu wa-salamu ala ashraf al-anbiya wal-mursaleen, Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi al-tayyibin al-tahirin wa ashabihi al-hadin al-muhtadin وعلى التابعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. I first presented a short PowerPoint presentation in April 2017 called Beyond Bilal, A History of Blackness in Islam, in one of the lecture halls of Oxford University to a group of students in an institution I could only have dreamed of attending, let alone speaking at. Back then I had no idea that the 30-minute presentation would evolve into a lecture series that would travel to over 50 universities across 3 different continents and result in this book that you have in your hands right now. The intersection between black history, identity, Islam and the Muslim world, especially in the West, is something that, although understudied, has long been a subject of debate and discussion, from as early as the 8th century with books like the famous or infamous Fakhr al-Sudan al-Baydan, The Glory of the Black Race over the White Race by 8th century polymath al-Jahiz, up until the Tanwir al-Ghabash fi Fadl al-Sudan al-Habash, the illuminating twilight concerning the virtue of Sudanese and Abyssinians of Ibn Jawzi in the 11th century, and Suyuti's Rafushan al-Habshan, elevating the prestige of Abyssinians in the 14th century. Although the subject is often belittled, overlooked or underemphasized in the Muslim community, the fact that these scholars who devoted themselves to producing books aimed at the most important of religious and secular sciences saw that it was just as important to write about it is a testament to the serious regard in which they held the subject and in which we should hold it as well. Most recently, due to the connection between the spread of Islam in the West and black liberation movements, with some of the most prominent figures in Western Islam such as Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali also being key figures in both the Muslim world and the black liberation struggle, we see that there's been a resurgent exploration of the connection between these two areas. And although many people seem to view these experiences as separate, they are in fact very much connected, a truth that led to the events that inspired Beyond Bilal. I grew up as a young black convert to Islam in inner city London, actually from down the road, I'm from Camden, and as part of a millennial generation that saw the world transform into a globalized community. Issues of race and identity were central to my existential search for meaning in society, and it was through my quest to reconnect to my history and identity as a young black man of West African descent that I discovered Islam and decided to adopt the faith. Wanting to know and understand who I was and where I came from beyond the popular narrative of slavery and colonization I was taught in school and unfortunately at home, I discovered the rich history of Islam in West Africa, its fearsome empires such as Mali and Songhai and Sokoto, and its charismatic scholars and saints such as Ahmadu Bamba and Sheikh Ibrahim Niass. They both represent a 1,000-year legacy born of the combination between traditional Islam and African culture, and I ended up becoming Muslim through the grandson of the latter, Imam Hassan Sizeh, towards the end of 2007. For me, uncovering this seemingly hidden legacy and history was like discovering a long-lost treasure or heritage, and I did my best in the following years to learn and study and immerse myself in it, absorbing as much information and history as possible. I traveled to the lands that I read about when I was able to, and sat at the feet of the people who inherited this rich legacy and tradition and history, internalizing this knowledge which not only informed my place within my new faith, but my place within the wider world. Then in October 2016, the Black and Muslim in Britain YouTube project was launched in an attempt to address the lack of faith representation during Black History Month in the UK, which consisted of black Muslims relating anecdotes and voicing their opinions and experiences of being black and Muslim. This was followed by other such projects which sparked a series of events and reactions, with black Muslims becoming the hot topic around the time that the idea for Beyond Bilal was born in 2017. This period also saw the global rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, which led black Muslims to start wondering at what their faith's answer was to the global questions surrounding their existence and identity. Should I stop or should I continue?
I think
it's a bit long, yeah?
That was good.
You get the idea.
Go on. Professor Brown.
Yeah, I feel like it's the whole getting you to do a reading thing. It's kind of, you feel bad if you read too much, but then like if you read too little, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a catch-22 or whatever. Not a catch-22. It's whatever. It's a difficult situation.
But inshallah, we'll encourage everyone to purchase the books and then, they can read it in their own time, huh?
So I'm just going to read the section called The Argument of This Book. Okay, well, feels weird saying this. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So that, not because like this book is so great, but just beginning what I'm doing. Though a contested concept, anti-Blackness is most succinctly understood as racism directed against people of sub-Saharan African descent. Stereotypes about real or imagined black Africans are nearly as old as historical records. From ancient Rome to medieval China, however, these stereotypes rarely stood out markedly in societies that were often cosmopolitan and where skin color played a less important role than other markers of identity. The notion that the rights and standing of people racialized as Black African were determined by that racialization became pervasive only in the early modern period, with the rise of the Atlantic slave trade and Europe's powerful colonial states. The understanding of race and blackness that formed in the West, particularly in the United States, have profoundly shaped global discourse. They have forced a dualistic template of black and white onto social terrains from Mali to Karachi, which are often too dissimilar or complex for such a binary. They have bound Black Africanness and slavery in an essential relationship when the link between the two has often been incidental. And they continue to insist that, quote, black as a mundane color descriptor cannot be separated from, quote, black as a negative metaphor when no such essential relationship exists. Not everyone everywhere, and particularly not speakers of African languages south of the Sahara, has collapsed blackness as skin tone and blackness as metaphor. Neither has aesthetic preference, always entitled judgments of human worth. Not all descriptions of color is prescription of value. In the West, Islam and Muslims have been particularly singled out as anti-black, an accusation emanating from a centuries-old Western stereotype of Muslims as slavers, as well as from contemporary American conservative cultural and political agendas. Anti-blackness is rampant in much of the Muslim world, from North Africa to South Asia. It causes real pain that goes unrecognized, but it does not originate in Islam's scriptures or in its system of law and ethics. Islamic civilization inherited stereotypes about Black Africans from the Greco-Roman conviction that climate shaped both body and personality, and from the Judeo-Christian lore about Africans being cursed with blackness and enslavement. Though the prominent Muslim scholars opposed these ideas as antithetical to the Quran, the bulk of the Islamic tradition indulged and added to this body of material. While anti-blackness did not define the lives and destinies of people with darker skin tones, from Morocco to India, Black African came to stand in for slave and correlate with inferior social status. The Sufi tradition, however, inverted this image, using it to represent the saint's journey from earthly subjugation to liberation through union with the divine. And it portrayed the Black African as the pious and devout slave of God, who taught and inspired his or her social betters. In Islamic law, particularly norms around marriage, when the correlation of blackness with low status and undesirability was recognized, it was as a social reality that law had to manage, not as a norm for it to protect. Whether in Islamic law or in how Black Africans have been perceived in other genres of Islamic scholarship, anti-blackness has been incidental, not essential. In law, Muslim jurists recognized that what blackness meant, whether it was attractive or unappealing, depended on where, when, and who was perceiving it. Negative stereotypes about Black Africans in Muslim writings on geography and ethnology were often mirrored by stereotypes about Slavs and Turks, and the association of blackness with slavery and primitiveness, including in the writings of many Black Muslims from the Sahel, ultimately turned not on phenotype, that's how you look, not on phenotype, but on their locating blackness beyond the southern boundaries of the abode of Islam. Whether anti-blackness was incidental or accepted as social customs, however, leading voices of Muslim scholarship from medieval to modern times have rejected it and advocated vigorously for the Prophet's teachings that no race or tribe has any inherent value over another. As judges, jurists, and moral guides, Muslim scholars have had to balance a realistic accommodation of custom with their duty to enjoin rights as the heirs of the Prophet. In light of the severity of the blight of anti-blackness today, it is clear that their duty as moral guides must be to promote the erasure of the color line.
No, I appreciate both of your readings, and the reason why I wanted to hear both of you, I wanted to see which parts of both of your books you wanted to read about. The reason being was because to see if my understanding of like your intention of why you was writing the book was in line with kind of what I kind of initially thought. From reading both of your books, like for example with Mustafa Briggs's book, for me I felt like you was taking me through a personal journey from you finding Islam, discovering not only about the rich tradition that we have about Black scholarship and African scholarship, also the fundamental role that both Black Muslims, both male and female, have played in the tradition. And you listed a number of like inspiring figures from West Africa even to like America, which not only from the time of the Prophet time was up until recent times. And also with Jonathan Brown's book, it was very extensive, well researched. I mean, it's about 400 pages, but it's very easy to read. And I like the way you was challenging okay, we've got this perception that Islam is anti-black, which some people, some critics of Islam have, whether they are black Orientalists or Pan-Africanists, and also some Muslims who may have some doubts that is the religion anti-black because of what they've heard or seen from some Muslims, even some respected Muslim scholars or intellectuals. So where you skillfully was addressing, okay, is the first, let's answer this question, is Islam anti-black? By looking at the Islamic legal tradition, it's particularly looking at the Maliki legal, Maliki madhab, some writers from Sufi saints, as well as some other Muslim contemporary and ancient scholars have said in relation to blackness. So they're both exceptional reads for different reasons, but they both deal with the topic of blackness and Islam. And funny enough, just before coming here, someone messaged me and was like, why are you attending an event about blackness and Islam with a non-black person speaking, as if a white person shouldn't be able to speak about race? And I think it's important that this is addressed. This book is phenomenal, both of the books, but particularly Islam and Blackness, from an academic perspective. And this idea that only black people or people of African descent can speak about race, I don't agree with that. And even within our Islamic tradition, we have great scholars such as Ibn al-Jawzi, who was not black, who wrote this phenomenal book called Tanwir al-Ghabash fi Fadli Sudan wal-Habash, which is roughly translated as Illuminating the Darkness regarding the virtues of black people and Abyssinians, like modern day people from the Horn of Africa. And you had Imam al-Suyuti as well, who also wrote a book speaking about the virtues of black people, because anti-blackness has been an issue from the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, up until recent times. So as Muslims, although we like to act like anti-black or racism doesn't exist, it does exist. But fortunately, we did have scholars of the past and today who are sitting with us, who are kind of addressing this issue, not only to kind of address that Islam is not an anti-black religion, but also to uplift and enlighten us about some great people of African descent who've contributed to not only world civilization, but Islamic history. My question I have for both of you is, what are the key takeaways that you'd like people to take from reading your book?
Go ahead. No, I started the last question. You can just
Yeah. I assume the person was talking about me, the one who asked the...
No, the person asked,
Yeah,
the
I just
person,
wanna
yeah,
check.
of course.
Yeah, I don't know. That's I hear that a lot. I don't know. So, just to say why I wrote this book, it wasn't like I woke up one day, I was like, I want to write about blackness. Because this is not something I ever thought about, right? People ask me, actually I wrote a book on Islam and slavery, and people were like, oh, you should write a book about Islam and race. I said, I'm not crazy. I'm not going to, what do you think, I'm nuts? But then during 2020, in the summer of 2020, there was this debate on this Research Africa academic listserv. And there's there were professors, actually like professors, with academic positions, making the argument that Islam is, not that Muslims are racist, right? That Islam at its scriptural core, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, is anti-black. So I wasn't on this listserv, I was like in the summertime, I was doing whatever. And people kept sending me emails, like, can you, someone's saying this, do you know about this hadith? What about this hadith? What about this Quranic verse? So I was like, okay, I'll look into it. And I finally eventually started researching this stuff. And then in order to answer one question, I had to answer another question, look at this, look at that. And so eventually it just piled up into a book. But it came out of people asking me questions about these accusations about Islam as a religion. So that's why the book exists. I think that I guess the argument I'd want someone to take away is that no, Islam's not anti-black. That's one thing, Let's put that aside. I think the other thing that there are two issues I think that I would really, maybe three. I'll try to be quick with them. Three issues I would like people to think about. But one is that so many questions about things like, think about this. Why do we call white people white? I'm not white. That paper is white. My skin's not white. Why do we call black people black? I've never met someone who actually has black skin. Like, these are the kind of basic questions that we don't really think about that are really, why do people where do they get names for colors? This is actually really interesting. I found it to be fascinating. That is stuff that it's very hard to find answers about. And I really enjoyed learning about in this book when I was writing this book. And you realize how much of these issues around color and race and appearance are like we don't really question where they come from and how they're shaped. That's one thing I found really interesting. The second thing is that we impose. I don't even think it's like a modern view. I think it's like a America. The United States is effectively imperially dominated, not just the world but also the past, right? So everybody today, whether, I mean, I'm not just talking about like, you know, what racist white people or something. Even people who, you know, let's say are like, you know, racialized as black, identify as black, are angry about racism, justifiably upset about this, right? Even everybody is looking at the past through a very specific lens that's created by a very specific society in a very specific time. And completely ignores the fact that all these other societies in human history have their own ways of thinking about race and color and community and all this stuff. And we just go back in time, we impose our like cookie cutter view of these issues on the past. And that's, as I say, it's sort of like imperial domination of the past. And even the people who are like, you know, anti-racist activists a lot of times are kind of complicit in this. I think that's something that's important to keep in mind. The third thing I want to say is that, you know, a lot of the questions about kind of race or community and identity and discrimination are actually very, very hard issues to resolve, right? So if you think about this, like, if you have, if let's say there's you know, like a Pakistani Muslim family in America, okay? And then there's a black Muslim family in America, like African American Muslims, you know, converted like 2-3 generations ago or something, right? And let's say the kids want to get married. The Pakistani parents, if they're hesitant about the marriage, right? Is it anti-black racism? Maybe, right? And maybe that's part of it. Or is it like this person is from another community, like they don't speak our language, they're not from the same culture? That, I mean, so one of them is invalid, right? The racism is unacceptable in our religion. Concern about culture and, you know, the ability of people to live together, have common expectations, ways of communication, that is valid, right? But how do you tell the difference? So it's really hard. Imagine you're a Muslim scholar and you're trying to figure out, like, someone brings you this issue. You have to try and balance, like, you can't look into people's hearts. And so there's like a real challenge in the Islamic tradition about trying to balance this mandate to deny the legitimacy of prejudice, to deny the legitimacy of discrimination on the one hand, but also to accept like the foibles of communities and like the need for humans to be able to relate to one another. And this is, it's really hard to see. It's almost like painful to watch Muslim scholars trying to balance these. I think that we have to have, you know, maybe like much more compassionate for some people who are involved in this.
I'd say before I start to speak about my book, I have just finished reading Professor Jonathan's book, and yeah, I loved it. Alhamdulillah, it was a very, very well researched and detailed book. And I feel as though the existence of this book is important in discourse around this subject, because the paradigms in which we see blackness, in which we see race, in which we see community, and the way in which we see the world, as the professor mentioned, is largely the result of things that we don't think about. So it's largely the result of Western academia and the way that Western society has defined the world and then applied those definitions on a global scale. And we've all been socialized to accept these Western terminologies in how we define ourselves as individuals and how we define race and how we define our function in society. And if we look at the global culture, like, as much as we all come from different parts of the world and we have different, as much as we come from different parts of the world and we have different ways of seeing things in different cultures and different languages, essentially we're all part of a Western global monoculture. All of us in all of our societies are products of colonization or Western education. And so the way in which we've been taught to see ourselves, whether we like it or not, is shaped by Western academia. And so when we see issues such as racism in Islam or blackness in Islam, even as Muslims, but as Western educated Muslims, it's important that we have people who represent Western academia and are products of Western academia that can produce works that can allow us to re-look at all of these issues. The same way, for example, these scholars in the past were the result of the highest standard of academia available in their times. And so they produced works that dealt with race and religion according to the paradigm of their time. The paradigm of our time is Western academia. So to have a Western academic who comes from a privileged class, you are white and you are Anglo-Saxon and you are essentially from the people that created all of these terms and definitions and the systems that define whiteness and blackness, for you to tackle this issue in the way that you have, I feel like it's very commendable, and it's essential for us to be able to read it and understand it. And it is a trend, if you follow Professor Jonathan's kind of trend in academia and in publishing books. The first book that I had from you was Misquoting Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which dealt with the accusations levied against hadith. And so you defended that issue as a Muslim. You felt it was your concern as a Western academic, but also as a Muslim, to answer the questions and the challenges of people against the hadith studies. And then when the question came to slavery, you also felt it was your responsibility as a Muslim to defend Islam and to defend the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ against the accusations levied against Islam via slavery. And so when the questions came about Islam and anti-Blackness, you felt it was your obligation as a Muslim, but also as a Western academic, to approach it in a way that uses your knowledge and your expertise and your privilege and your skills to defend the Prophet ﷺ and to defend the deen. And so I do commend you for that, and I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I would recommend everybody to purchase a copy because it has a lot of information. And so with my book, on the other hand, the main takeaway for me was that if you compare the two books, Islam and Blackness deals with how these social phenomena came about and how we can address the accusations levied against Islam about the origins of these accusations. So for example, how the racialization of black and white came about in the world at large and then in Muslim society specifically, how anti-black racism crept into the Islamic tradition, how racial discrimination crept into the practice of Islamic law. It answers the questions about the origins of these and possibly solutions and defenses for these. My book, on the other hand, was more about dealing with the results of these things as a lived experience, as a black Muslim, somebody that has faced these discriminations or this anti-blackness, etc., and appealing to Muslims to re-look at history in the lens of how they practice Islam today. And so I say that to say, for example, many of the people that I speak about in Beyond Bilal, and this is like a criticism that I've received in the book, wouldn't have been classified as being black in their societies at the time that they lived in, because blackness as a term, not as a physical description, but as a social terminology, did not exist at that time. Because there's black, as Professor mentioned in his book, with a lowercase b, and then there's black with a capital B. There's black in terms of a physical description and a phenotype, and then there's also black as a social status and as a product of specific social events that produced a class of people that were racialized as black without them having essentially been black. And so my premise of the book is that if we racialize people as black in the 21st century, and we have a certain stereotypes associated to them, and we have certain ways in which we interact with them, and we have certain discriminations that we hold against them, if we were to re-look at the past with the same lens that we look at the present, many of the figures classified in the Quran would be considered to be black. Many of the figures around the Prophet ﷺ would be considered to be black. Many of the amazing nations and states that contributed to the development of Islam as we know it today were established by black people. And so then how would we now look at the way in which we interact with our own history and our own identity as Muslims if we still have inherent anti-blackness and discrimination within our practice of Islam? And so my main takeaway for the book was just basically, if you have these issues, if you do discriminate against black people, or as a black person, if you don't feel as though you have a place within the religion and you feel discriminated against, it's important to reevaluate the tradition with this lens that we've been given now, to realize that many of the major figures that laid the foundations for the deen as we have it today were black. And so this attitude and these kind of practices in terms of racism, anti-blackness, colorism, etc., shouldn't exist in somebody who has real love for Allah, real love for the prophets, real love for the messengers, because for many of them, if they were to live in this day and age, they would be racialized as the same people that are discriminated against. Kind of long-winded. but
No,
I
thank
hope
you.
you got it. Yeah.
No, it was good. My next question is, you've kind of both answered it in both of your previous questions, but if you can kind of expand on, what would you say was the source or sources for anti-black racism amongst Muslims in history?
I'll pass that to the professor because he explained it really well in the book.
Really? Sure. I mean, I feel bad. Because like half your answer, you were talking about saying how good my book was. So I felt like, oh man, I'm so guilty. I mean, I also read his book, by the way, which I really enjoyed. And I had a copy, but I gave it away. So I have to get another copy. Okay. So it's interesting. Like the sources are, you can think of like a couple of sources, right? This is so one is kind of general in the sense that if you're in parts of the world that are fairly far from the equator, so you could think about, let's say, North Africa north, the central India north, right? There's actually kind of a weirdly common sense link between darkness and lower status, in the sense that if you have to work outside in the sun and like not only are you getting tanner, but you're getting dirty, right? So the idea of blackness as darker in skin tone because you're tanned, right? You're burned by the sun, but also blackness because you're covered in dirt. Your hands are dirty and like calloused and stuff like that. The idea, and then versus the lighter skinned person is doesn't have to go outside, doesn't have to get dirty. So you have this association of kind of darkness with lower status, manual labor, that kind of stuff, and lighter skin with like higher status. So in that you can imagine there you have sort of one potential source for valuation of lighter skin tone over dark skin tone. The second is, I would actually say that it's really, it's sort of the unfortunate kind of the Judeo-Christian tradition. I generally don't like to cast blame on religious traditions, but I think you can clearly identify this in the Old Testament, the idea of the curse of Ham. So this is the story in the book of Genesis where one of Noah's son Ham, Noah gets blotto drunk and passes out naked. I'm not saying this actually happened. This is in the Old Testament, okay? And Ham, his son, does not cover him up, and his other sons do. And so when Noah comes to, he curses some of Ham's descendants with being slaves to his brothers. Notice being slaves, right? Now, what happens let's say between roughly 200 BC and around 400 AD or 500 AD, is you have other versions of this story emerge in kind of Judeo-Christian lore where it's also a curse of blackness. So it's a curse of slavery and blackness, or blackness or slavery, right? And also the idea drawn from the biblical scriptures that Ham's descendants populate Africa. So if you put this all together, you get black Africans are sort of cursed to be slaves. And then if you add to this kind of Greco-Roman notions of science and how climate affects not just how we look, but how we think and our personality, there's this idea that kind of Africans, and it's not because they're Africans, because they're in the South hot areas, they're sort of like emotional and really sexual and, kind of hot-headed and maybe not so smart. Right? By the way, they also say people in the far north are not so smart, but they're also drunk most of the time. So these are some of the ideas. But you can see if you take these together, you get kind of a pretty potent mixture. Now, when in the Islamic tradition, really major scholars like Ibn al-Jawzi, Suyuti, and others, Dimashqi in kind of geography and sciences, they totally deny this story of the curse of Ham. They say it's inaccurate scientifically. It goes against the reliable hadiths we have on the origin of how people look, right? And but unfortunately, although they're very high status, they're a minority in the Islamic tradition, and a lot of Muslim scholarship just kind of like it's just taking a lot of material from the biblical tradition. One of the things it takes is this notion of the curse of Ham, right? And so there's this, you get this association of blackness and slavery.
Yeah, I don't think I need to add much
Yeah, I
more
was
to
about
that.
yeah.
But it was literally one of the things that I highlighted from the book when you summarized it and you said Islamic civilization inherited stereotypes about black Africans from the Greco-Roman conviction that climate shaped both body and personality, and the Judeo-Christian law about Africans being cursed with blackness and enslavement. And although prominent Muslim scholars oppose these ideas as antithetical to the Quran, the bulk of the Islamic tradition indulged and added to the body of that material.
Shukran. I actually wanted to ask you, Mustafa. One of my favorite chapters was your last chapter, Daughters of Hajar, where you spoke about female scholarship in African Islamic tradition. Reason being is because I think one thing, even in my book, I kind of overlooked, which people kind of criticise me for, rightly so, is as much as we speak about the contribution of black people, it's always black men. And then oftentimes we don't hear about the contribution of black women, black Muslim women in particular. And I was very glad that, mashallah, you dedicated a chapter acknowledging and celebrating the contributions of black Muslim women in history. Do you mind talking a little bit about that chapter and why you dedicated a chapter specifically about female scholarship in the Islamic African tradition?
Okay, yeah. Personally, one of the main reasons was during the presentation that I gave about Beyond Bilal. I grew up seeing representations of, and I took a large portion of my Islam from female West African scholars. So as much as, I mentioned I came into Islam through Sheikh Hassan Cisse, it was his niece, Aisha Cisse, who lives here in the UK, that taught me how to read and write the Quran. And I memorized the last juz with her. So like my Quranic education and my Arabic education began with her. And when I got to know her family, I realized that all of her mother and all of her aunts had memorized the Quran and were scholars. Her father's side, same thing. Her grandmother had memorized the Quran and was a scholar. She studied the Arba'in and Nawawi and memorized them along with her brothers. And she was known as somebody of knowledge. And it goes back generations and generations. Her grandmother was the daughter of Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, and he had over 40 daughters that all memorized the Quran, and they all became scholars in their own right and wrote books and started organizations and built masajid and were very, very active. And whenever I would go to Senegal, I would visit them, I would spend time with them, I would study with them, and they were accorded the exact same status and respect as the male scholars were. And that was just how society functioned. The same way you'd visit a son of Sheikh Ibrahim and learn from him and seek blessings from him is the same way you would do so for a daughter. The only difference became in things like leading salah, for example. Women don't lead salah because of fiqh and all of those kind of things. But other than that, there wasn't really that distinction between male and female figures of authority. And so that was something I grew up seeing, but then I never really saw replicated in a lot of other religious manifestations of the Muslim community. And it was something that is severely lacking in the West as well. We don't really see female scholars in the same way we see male scholars. There are not as many female sheikhas and teachers who are as prominent as the male figures for many different cultural reasons. And so I wanted to highlight that to show that not only was there a history of that in West Africa that wasn't being spoken about and wasn't known, but also that it has deep relations to the female scholarship tradition in Islam anyway. The Quran as we know it came to us through a woman, because after the Quran was compiled by Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Sayyidina Umar, they entrusted it with Sayyidah Hafsa, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ. And so when Sayyidina Uthman started to produce his copies of the Quran and send them out to the Muslim world, he did so from the copy that he took from Hafsa. When we speak about hadith and Sharia, 25% of the Sharia comes from Aisha radiallahu anha, who was a female scholar. And when we look at some of our greatest scholars, such as Imam al-Shafi'i, his main teacher, even though he had hundreds of teachers, including Imam Malik, the teacher that he loved and respected the most, and the teacher who sponsored his education when he was in Egypt, was Sayyidah Nafisa, who was a great-granddaughter of the Prophet ﷺ. And he respected her to the point that when he passed away, he wrote in his will that he wanted his body to be taken to her so that she could make dua for him before he was buried. And then even before all of that, Mecca, the city that we face 5 times a day towards to pray, the city that we have to visit at least once in our lifetime, the city that when we go there and we perform Hajj, we run in between Safa and Marwa. We do all of these things because of a woman. Zamzam was discovered by a woman. The first inhabitant of Mecca was a woman, and she was the one that established the city and made the city into a city. And not only was she a woman, but we know that she was an African woman and she was a black woman. So all of these things kind of intersect. And my reasoning and my proof for the blackness of Hajar, because a lot of people challenged me on that, was that if we go to the Sirah of Ibn Hisham, which is one of the earliest biographies of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ is very specific when he speaks to his companions, and he tells them a day will come when you will enter Egypt. And he says, when you enter Egypt and you see the people with dark skin and curly hair, treat them well because they are our relatives through blood and our relatives through marriage. Egypt at the time that the Prophet ﷺ started to send letters had already been dominated by the Romans, had already been invaded by the Greeks, etc. Even the person who was in charge of Egypt that the Prophet ﷺ gives da'wah to and sends a letter to, Al-Muqawqis, his name actually translates as the Caucasian because he was of Greek origin, and it was the Greeks and the Romans who were administering Egypt at the time that had placed him in power over Egypt. But the Prophet ﷺ was speaking about the original inhabitants of Egypt being dark skin and curly hair, and that his ancestor Hajar was from amongst them. So when we talk about marginalized communities within the Muslim world, when we talk about things such as racism and discrimination, they're always kind of interlinked. The subjugation of black people within Islam, or the minimization of black people in Islam, is also the same as the minimization of females in Islam. And so the fact that Mecca was established by a black female brings together the two struggles, and so that's why I decided to write that 5th chapter.
Perfect. Shukran. Professor Brown, do you mind sharing some thoughts on I think it's the final appendix on Islam and the caste in South Asia? Because oftentimes when we think about anti-blackness, it's generally within the sub-Saharan Africa or African American context, whereas I'm glad that you actually spoke about the issue of anti-blackness or colorism within the South Asian context. So do you mind just talking a little bit about that appendix, please?
Yeah. By the way, I want you. So when I was writing this book, after I finished writing it, I was like, I wonder if because Habib actually wrote several books on this topic. He hasn't mentioned this, but I was like, I wonder if he would, I could email him. He would give me advice. So I sent him the Word document, and I was like, maybe like you could look at it or something. This book is a fairly long book, right? So he's like Goodwill Hunting Akande, as far as I can tell, because one day later, not even a day later, he sends me back the whole, and he annotated the whole thing, mashallah. I've never seen anybody who can read mashallah this fast, so I would like, take lessons from you or something. So he gave me comments on the whole thing. It was very valuable. He's too modest to talk about this. So, this is kind of pretty well-studied issue, and I just was drawing on existing scholarship of notion of colorism. So again, I talked about this before, right? The idea that, so first of all, you have these kind of a long traditions of what lighter skin, darker skin means in societies where there's like a potential for large variation in that. And you add to that, let's say, colonization by European society, like let's say Britain in India, and the idea, not only do you kind of, there's sort of a standard of beauty being imposed by the colonizer that you want to imitate, and then the colonizer is also favoring people that kind of look like them, right? So there's that dynamic added to it. You have a strong element of colorism in South Asia. Although there's a lot of debate in South Asia about whether or not this kind of colorism goes back to the pre-modern period or if it's a product of colonialism, but we won't get into the debates. But the reason, so that's one issue. The reason I was interested in caste, however, was because I was trying to think of something where, because there's not a lot of, in the fiqh tradition, you do have discussions about blackness and what that means in terms of marriage and things like that, but it's not like incredibly well discussed and fleshed out. Whereas one thing where you do have this really discussed at length is in the question of caste and marriage amongst Muslims in India, basically, South Asia. So I was really interested in how, looking at the way Muslim scholars talked about caste. And sort of, it's just like the example of blackness we talked about, right? There's some Muslim scholars who are like, look, Muslims are equal, right? And caste is this is not from the Islamic tradition. Okay, so you know this is not Islamic. We know what our values are, so it's clear that we shouldn't indulge this at all. On the other hand, Muslim scholars say, probably the majority of South Asian Muslim scholars say, okay, but one, we're part of the rules around Islamic laws of marriage is that we're supposed to respect custom, right? We're supposed to respect custom. As long as it doesn't violate the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet, like we can respect it. And if part of that is, you know, that there are these different castes and different communities and they really don't want to mix a lot, and if they mix, it causes a lot of social problems, like we kind of have to respect that. So you have this I was really interested in seeing how Muslim scholars weighed these priorities and using it as a kind of analogy to think about how we should do the same thing with race. That's why I discussed that.
I'm just conscious. I think we've got 5 minutes. Can I ask another question, or just open up for everyone? People look at me like they want to ask a question, so maybe my questions aren't entertaining enough. So, shall we open up? Does anyone want to ask a question?
Jazakallah khair to all three of you. It's been such an interesting conversation. I had a burning question, that's why I just wanted to get it out of my head so I could enjoy the rest of the conversation. But I research in a field called pre-modern race studies, and I look mostly at European literature, also English literature, but there's a lot of emphasis on the kind of figurative conception of darkness and how it feeds into biblical texts. And because I'm not trained in sort of Islamic scholarship, but obviously as a Muslim, these concepts concern me. And so I know Dr. Brown, when in your book in Islam and Slavery, you sort of talk about how you saw these tropes of slavery in the Quran, and then you were thinking about slavery in general, how that kind of fits into the Islamic tradition. And I guess that's something I sort of find myself encountering when I'm reading the Quran. The trope of darkness, this kind of figurative notion of darkness, and its sort of its signification. And so I was just wondering, ask questions for any of you, I suppose, but how you kind of conceptualize darkness in relation to the idea of sort of phenotypical blackness or phenotypical darkness within sort of Islamic thought, how that's sort of negotiated. Thank you.
Good question.
Yeah, go ahead. Because I liked the chapter. Sorry. I like the chapter in the book that dealt with that as well, because we do have those. Sorry, I keep talking about this, but do you know what it is? I did the same thing as Habib. I started reading the book yesterday and I finished it today. So it's still fresh on my mind.
It's not going to be good, people. I'm going to be obliterated. Social media is going to be obliteration. Obliterated.
So, the only thing I would say, sorry to interject, is before answering about darkness, I think even as Muslims, when we think about slavery, we shouldn't just think about black people. And I think that's an issue that I think a number of Muslims have that's not from Islam. So oftentimes when I ask people, when people think about slavery, they might think of Bilal radiallahu anhu. But then I pose the question, how come we don't think of Yusuf alayhi salam? He was enslaved and he was in the Quran. So even as Muslims, maybe we need to change the way we view some of these concepts, whether it's slavery and even darkness being somewhat negative when it shouldn't be. That's the only thing I want to say on that, but sorry.
Yeah, so my to relate to your question was that you were speaking about the usage of darkness and light metaphorically in biblical scripture, but then we also have that accusation levied against us in the Islamic tradition, because there are verses in the Quran, for example, when Allah speaks about the people who receive paradise in the Akhirah as being people whose faces have become brightened or whitened, and then people who are about to go to be punished are darkened, their faces are darkened. And then also verses that deal with, for example, the Arab custom of not valuing female children or valuing male children over female children. Allah describes in a particular verse the fact that when a female child is born to them, their faces are darkened, or their faces become dark. And so for many people, when we see that translate into the Islamic tradition, not specifically the Quran and the Sunnah per se, but the scholars' interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah, you see many scholars make problematic statements, or statements that would seem problematic in our time, where they take these metaphorical descriptions and say that they will become physical, phenotypical descriptions. And so they talk about, for example, people's faces literally being turned black and literally being turned white. And so, yeah, I won't give away too much. The defense of that and the interpretation of that in the book is really good. But I would say it's something that's present within our tradition that we need to question and I'll hand the question over to the professor who researched it.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you know, there's sometimes when you're trying to explain something and your argument's not very good. In this case, I feel very confident. I mean, if you look at, okay, let me say it this way. In the Islamic tradition, there's a very clear division between metaphor and phenotype when it comes to black and white, which is very interesting because that's not the case in, let's say, modern America. You know, like people want to change, you know, like blacklist or something. They want to like take away, you know, like there's this constant melding, inability to distinguish between metaphor and race in our society, right? But I'm not going to criticize that or say what's right or wrong, right? But the point is, in the Islamic scholarly tradition, there's a very clear distinction. So even when they talk about whitened faces and blackened faces, they might say your face actually becomes black, but like they say very explicitly, that's not like black people. This is otherworldly. This is otherworldly. This isn't like in our world, right? So this is very explicit. Either they say it's metaphoric, or if it's actually physical, then it's something completely different from this universe. Right? The second thing, and what's very interesting, is if you look at, let's say, black African scholars like Abdallah Danfodio or Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse or Sheikh Dem in Senegal, they come to these verses, they don't go in like, oh my God, like, yeah, but you know, it's they just say, oh yeah, it's the same thing everyone else said. Black means you've been ignoble, you've been, you know, denigrated, lowly. White means you're proud and noble. And the reason they do this is because in early Islamic Arabic and pre-Islamic Arabic, you don't see the division of, if we're going to talk about skin color and people's appearances, you don't have black-white binary, right? So in early pre-Islamic Arabic and early Islamic Arabic, black and white, if you're using that binary, this is a metaphoric binary. So if you're white of face, that means you're noble. If you're black of face, it means you're ignoble, right? If you want to talk about how people look, if you have a binary, it's black and red. So, and there's a debate, by the way, about whether or not Arabs are in the black or the red group. So, black and red. The other way is a tripartite division of black, red, and white. So, when Muslim scholars are presented by the black-white with a black-white binary, if they go back to their own linguistic tradition and like Hadith and Quran and early Islamic Arabic dictionaries, black-white is, oh, this is metaphorical. This is in contrast, by the way, and again, I hate doing this, but it's true. The early Christian tradition is very different. There is an immediate and very intense kind of perforation or blending of black as phenotype and black as metaphor. And you go back to the writings of the church fathers, John Chrysostom, Augustine, etc., you'll see the idea of the devil is the black one. And there's a story in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament about the washing of the Ethiopian. An Ethiopian guy comes to become Christian, he gets baptized. And when he's baptized, he is brightened, he is whitened, he looks different. And then if you look at like medieval European prints and illustrations of this, he comes out looking like, you know, those like angel babies, like cherubs. He looks like a little Gerber baby, you know, like the Gerber baby. He comes out like he looks like a white guy. He looks like me. So in the early Christian tradition, this persists. There's a very quick blending of metaphor and phenotype, to the point that they're inextricable after that. Whereas in the Islamic tradition, they really stay apart. And sometimes they cross over a little bit, but there's like a very consistent separation between the two.
Yeah. Can I add to that? I wanted to just add as well, with regards to the tripartite classification of race that was used by the Arabs, it's interesting to see that for Arabs, the way that they use the term white in the Arabic language has been translated into our languages as if it's the equivalent of how we use white today, when that wasn't the case. So when we look at, for example, the Prophet ﷺ in a hadith saying he was sent to the black and the red for many people who explain this hadith, they said the blacks included Africans and Arabs, and then the red were Europeans, because they were familiar with the Roman Empire. They were familiar with people who lived in these European regions, Eastern European regions, etc., that were all part of the territories of the Romans. And so when they described Romans who would have been closer to, even darker than, but closer to what we consider Anglo-Saxon white today, they weren't described as white by Arabs, they were described as Ahmar, red. When they spoke about Persians who had a lighter skin tone than the Arabs, they didn't describe them as white, they described them as Asfar, yellow. And then when they spoke about people within their own region, who would include people who had interacted with East Africans, etc., they would be described as Abiyad or Aswad. But that bayad, that lightness, was seen as a completely different color from what we describe as white. But then when we translate Abiyad into English, we use white and we associate it with European whiteness, when that wasn't how the Arabs thought of being white in the first place. It's like if we go to certain parts of Africa, for example, people that are mixed race would be described as being white. They're not white, they're mixed race, they're brown, they're lighter skin, but because they're lighter than the general population, they're described white in the context of darkness. And then when we look at the descriptions of the Arabs in classical lexicons of the Arabic language, many scholars such as Ibn Mandur, etc., describe the fact that for the majority of Arabs, their skin color was darker, it was more to the Aswad. So when we see this hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he sees a group of black sheep, and then the white sheep start to come, and they increase in number until they are more white sheep, and the black sheep are not seen anymore. When he tells Sayyidina Abu Bakr this dream, Sayyidina Abu Bakr interprets it as, that means that the non-Arabs will enter into us and will be indistinguishable, and they will share our wealth and our lineage with us to the point that they become indistinguishable from us. And the Sahaba were like, so will the non-Arabs really come in and mix with us to that level? And then when you see the context of the Futuhat, like when the Muslims from the Arabian Peninsula expand into the former territories of the Eastern Roman Empire and Persia, we start to see that happen. Many of the people that we classify as Arab today or Middle Eastern today are of Levantine descent or Phoenician descent or Eastern Roman descent, because the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire was Constantinople in Turkey, or Damascus before that in Syria. So Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, all of these places were called Romans to the Arabs, and they were described as red people to the Arabs, but now, today, they're described as being Arab. So it's just about understanding historical context, understanding definitions. And so even when we see the word Abiyad in the Quran or whitened, etc., it's not the same white as what we conceptualize as white today, which is linked to a very Eurocentric and Anglo-Saxon definition of white, because those people were described as something completely different by the Arabs that were using the Quran at the time.
Shukran. Yeah, and also just add to that, I think it's also important when we are reading the Quran or Hadith, or especially these historical books, especially in relation to race, we have to understand how words was used in the 7th century Arabia, not in our modern context. And especially even when we look at race, similar to what Professor Brown said, even when we look at race, which viewpoint, which vantage point are we looking at? So in America, we've got the binary black-white. In other parts of the world, they don't look at race that way. And oftentimes, we project our own prejudices and biases when we're reading historical texts. So I think we have to kind of be careful with that. And quick story. When I was studying in Egypt, I remember when I was, one of my tutors, he was teaching me pre-Islamic poetry, and he was talking about how the way the Arabs used to praise women. And they used to describe the women like a baqara, like a cow. And I was like, that's offensive. He said, no, that's beautiful. He said, no, she's a cow. I was like, okay, that's offensive. How can you call a woman a cow? Because again, from a British context, to call a woman a cow, she's probably going to attack you. Then he was explaining, he said, okay, wait, just think with me. I was like, okay. Imagine you're in the desert, okay? You're sitting down, there's not much going around, and then you envision that you see a cow. And how a cow's turned around and it's walking slowly. Look at the gait of a cow. Now picture a voluptuous woman. Oh, I got it. Do you understand the context? So for them, in that case, it's actually the link of a cow to a woman in that context is actually a praiseworthy thing. But if you're taking it from a modern day Western, European or British context, you automatically assume it's a negative. And so Maybe that's an inappropriate story, but I thought I'd share it. Anyway, next question.
Just two quick comments on the cow issue.
Yeah.
Bakar Washi in Arabic, it's like a deer, more like a deer. So, yeah.
But then, like, Maha is a name. The guy told my students that Maha means water buffalo. Water buffalo is even worse than cow, right? You call a woman a water buffalo, I imagine that's like another level of bad, right? But then, and I have a picture to prove this, they do have very beautiful eyes. So the idea is a water buffalo has a very beautiful eyes, so that's what you're actually complimenting them on.
Oh, sorry, there's a question. I was.
wow.
Sorry.
I didn't even see those.
Do you think there will be a book for other population, i.e. Vikings, Chinese, Koreans, what's SEAs? Oh, sorry, Southeast Asians. Does someone, Professor Brown, do you want to answer that? So do you think there will be for book, I'm assuming someone's asking, do you think there will be a similar book?
I doubt it. Oh, I mean, I don't think, I mean, there's not a lot of like anti-white races. I mean, I don't like, you know, I've never seen like a tall blonde Norwegian person getting discriminated against, but I'm not sure. Maybe it happens, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't think, but it is interesting because, so I was just looking at my hands during this talk. You know what's really entertaining is just like looking at my skin color change. It's like my skin color is not, this is not white. I don't know what this is. My hands are currently like some kind of purple or pink. So my point about this is, imagine you're like so the Roman word, who came up with the idea of calling people white? The Romans. Okay, so white in Rome, albus, means basically like Mediterranean, Araby look. So that's why when Arabs say white, they mean someone who's kind of like got a Mediterranean type look. And that's actually shared with Latin. When Romans talked about people who look like, whose hands are like mine or look like me, they say pallidus. They would say pallidus. It means pallid or candidus. That's not white. I'm not white. I'm another thing. And if you come across, imagine you're an Arab, you've been hanging out in the Mediterranean with Persians and, you know, Coptic Christians, everyone's got like really good tan, they've got great hair, et cetera, et cetera. They're like, you know, you go to Ireland. Imagine you're like, holy moly. What are you gonna call people? They call them blue, they call them red, because their hair is scraggly and, you know, ugly. They're really kind of grotesque. So I think it's interesting to think about, like, there was a time when people who were whatever white, Northern European, they were kind of weird looking to other people in the world.
Can you take the next question? Because there's going to be more questions. So
Next question.
Yeah, this question's for you. Could you elaborate on what colour the skin of the noble Prophet ﷺ was? There are a lot of seeming contradictions in the narrations.
So the main narrations that we see, if we study the Shama'il, and this was a book that, alhamdulillah, I just finished restudying recently, so it's still fresh in my mind. The most popular descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ use the word abiyad, which I explained earlier was not the white that we know today, but it definitely wasn't dark, which was Adam or Aswad. There is a narration from Anas ibn Malik, who was the servant of the Prophet ﷺ, who describes him as being brown, but that is a very unique description. But most of the other descriptions describe him as being abiyad, with the main one in the Shama'il being that he wasn't abiyad amhaq and he wasn't Adam. So abiyad amhaq means extremely light skin or extremely pale, and then Adam, according to, like, if we look at Ibn Mandur Lisan al-Arab, they say anything darker than asmar is considered Adam. So I'm considered asmar in Egypt. You've studied in Egypt. I don't know if you've been called Samra before.
Abu Aswad,
Chocolate, yeah. People of our skin tone are described as being asmar or aswad, but people who are Adam complexion, they're described as being darker. So with the description of the Prophet ﷺ as being not abiyad amhaq, meaning he wasn't extremely light, and then not Adam, he wasn't extremely dark. The same way, for example, he wasn't extremely tall, but he wasn't extremely short. His hair wasn't extremely curly, but it wasn't extremely straight. The Prophet ﷺ was described as being in the medium of all of the different variations. according to the way that he's described by his companions. So yeah, do with that what you will, inshallah.
So what was you called in Egypt again?
Huh? Samra.
Samra. He wasn't called black like me, but I used to respond. I had a sharp tongue. Ahmak, Himar,
Okay.
yeah. So anyway, I've got a question for both of you.
Is it on the board? Or
It's on the board, but I've written.
Okay.
Other than women and blackness, what other groups do you think need to be uplifted in the Islamic tradition? Professor Brown, do you want to go for that one?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure.
Hoping someone's not.
I can think. I have to think about it.
Andrew Tate or something.
I'm not sure either, but I feel as though, and it relates to the early question of should there be books written.
Yeah.
If you're one of the people that come from these groups and you feel as though you need to write a book, you should write a book.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
Yeah, I felt like I needed to write a book, so I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should I put it to the floor? Okay, I've been instructed to the floor. So, anyone got a question?
One of the kind of persistent bulwarks of racism in the contemporary period is scientific racism. Seemingly doesn't seem to go away. And I've seen many Muslims, especially those who are quite educated in the West, subscribe to it. They'll say that X people are the way they are because of their race. They'll say that X people have a lower IQ because of race, and they'll subscribe to it. They'll act like these are scientific facts that are uncomfortable truths for other people. What are your experiences with scientific racism, and how do you respond to it from the perspective of the Islamic tradition?
Good question. Professor Brown, do you want to answer that one first? And then...
You should go first.
Okay.
In terms of why that is the case within the Muslim community, it relates to what I said earlier in terms of, for most of us, even if we are Muslim, even if we come from Muslim cultures, Muslim backgrounds, Muslim heritages, or Muslim majority countries, we're all products of colonization and we're all products of Western education. And we all are part of this global Western monoculture that is formed by Western academia, and this pseudoscience is a part of that academia. So anybody who studied in school, anybody who has taken part in this global monoculture will have remnants of this with them. In terms of my personal experience, I see certain things and I hear certain things. So like, for example, sometimes I'll speak, or sometimes there'll be a video of me that I'll see online circulating, and somebody would say, "Oh wow, he's so eloquent." And I'm thinking in my head, I know why, because you don't assume that somebody that looks like me would be able to speak English as well as I do, or would be able to articulate myself as well as I do, or not speak in particular dialects or whatever. I can speak all dialects of English. If you see me outside of an academic setting, I'll be speaking English in a very different way. If you see me at home, for example, I come from an ethnic group called the Creole, who are descended from liberated Africans who returned to Africa after the slave trade. So we have a specific dialect of English that we speak at home called Creole that is unintelligible to most people who speak English, and it's similar to Jamaican patois. So any song that I hear in Jamaican patois, I can understand 100%, and I can by proxy speak that as well. But I say all of this to say, you do see the remnants of it in thought, but I feel like that's all the product of Western education, essentially. And then also us as non-white people trying to classify ourselves in the system that has been created by white supremacy. So for many of us, instead of trying to decolonize or deconstruct these concepts, we try to say, okay, well, let me get in where I can fit in. So if white is up here and black is up here, well, I'm not 100% black, I'm part Arab, or I'm part this, or well, I'm Asian, so I'm closer to this than this. And then you take on those inherent inferiority complexes, and then you project them on other people as well, because you're trying to, get as close to the hierarchy as you can, or get far up in the hierarchy as you can. So I feel like it's all about kind of understanding the origins of these thoughts and then deconstructing them as a solution.
I think people are just afraid of, they're afraid of losing what they have. They're afraid of the world around them. They can't understand or control it. And so they kind of try to just think about how they're somehow going to be always on top because other people are incapable. And it comes out of insecurity and fear. And, people, if white people say this, I think they need to hang out like around more white people, because I don't really know this whole understand like white supremacy that well, because when I meet white people, they're kind of I don't know, they've got a lot of problems in this America. I don't want to get into it, but like you could do a lot of a lot of work on the different social problems they have, and you could say, oh, this is because of your I mean, it's ridiculous. Or Jahid says something really interesting in the he dies in 255, it's like around 850s 860s of the Common Era, and people were saying to him, like the Indians we meet and the black people we meet, the Africans, they're not that smart. And he's like, yeah, you know why? Because that guy was like some farmer that somebody grabbed out of his farm and like stuck on a boat and brought here. And like some Indian guys like, grabbed him out of his farm, right, and brought him here as a slave. We know that the Indians like have all these mathematical formulas that we've been copying. We've been like using their mathematics. He'll talk about, for example, the eloquence of Ethiopians. We know about all these like things that we respect the Ethiopians for, but you're not thinking about that. You're just thinking about the people that you happen to interact with here, who are, surprise, not some super well educated Indian or super well educated Ethiopian who ends up here, right? So a lot of these assessments are based on taking people who've been like victimized or have their identity obliterated, or like multi-generation for like 2 centuries have every chance at having a family or any stability obliterated, education obliterated, and then you're like, what's wrong with you? Like, why aren't you smart like me? I mean, so the answers to this I think are well known, and it's the fact that people don't accept it I think is just because they're deep down very insecure.
It's very interesting. Just wanted to, I'm not quite sure what the question is, but it's a bit muddled in my head. Just wanted to talk through this concept of white and black, this binary concept, and how that looks. So not with the traditional, Ahmer and but in the modern day with the rise of the Black Lives Movement matter. So we had, what to me is becoming clear was white is this colonial race, and black is everybody else, which includes people who are of white skin colour, but not of that Caucasian, supreme race. You have the white other, which is Eastern Europeans, but if you're Arab, if you're Asian, it doesn't matter if your skin colour is white, you are still black. And one of the things that came up during this whole Black Lives Matter thing was, well, we're South Asian, and my children say, well, we're brown. Where do the brown people fit into this? So I find it quite interesting in the sense that, mashallah, we're talking about black people today, and I just want to say that some of the best Muslims I've met are black Muslims. I've always felt that they carry a special piety, extremely good character, so my experience has been really wonderful with them. But I do think that, and I appreciate there's racism towards them within... racism towards our black brothers and sisters from within the community. I'm not denying that, but I do think that as a whole, if we're all lumped together as black, and somehow it's okay to paint us all with one brush, whether we're Chinese or Asian or Bangla or Malaysian or African or Jamaican or whatever we are, it's taking away from the nations and tribes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us. But yet, I think at the same time we have that solidarity of being dumbed down because we were invaded and not given those opportunities, and that we are all in a similar sort of place. And I think it's really great that you've done this today. I'm not sure what my question is, but it was all a bit kind of muddled in my head.
Alhamdulillah. I appreciate your contribution. Thank you for that. And I think it's interesting when we think about this binary concept of being black and white, because it's something that we don't really see develop until the modern era in terms of blackness and whiteness as we know it today. And if we study America as the case study, because America is where everything kind of starts and then it infects the rest of the world, and we kind of sign up to the concepts that exist in America, you're correct in saying, like, for example, whiteness begins as the colonizers, and it's a power dynamic rather than an actual racial classification. And so instead of looking at people phenotypically and describing them as black and white, people become racialized. So you see, for example, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are the ones that establish America and hold all the power in America. So when, for example, Irish Catholics immigrate, at first they're not considered white. And then when you see Jewish East Europeans immigrate, they're not considered white. When you see Italians come and immigrate, they're not considered white. But then as things change and power dynamics change, they're given an opportunity to assimilate into whiteness and not be a part of the other. And so they start to assimilate into that white power structure. It's the same with the UK. If we look in the UK in the 1960s, there was a term that was called political blackness, in which even people of South Asian descent would describe themselves as being black because they felt as though they were other than the white people. And then when power dynamics change, that's when we start to see different categories develop of Asian and brown and all of these things. So it's something that shows how arbitrary the concept of race actually is, because it's something that's not a reality. It doesn't exist. And I say the same thing about Africa, to be honest. I don't feel like Africa as a concept exists, because Africans before colonization never described themselves as Africans. They described themselves as whatever tribe or ethnicity or kingdom that they were part of. But then when Africa becomes a colonial project and there's the scramble for Africa and Europeans define what the boundaries of Africa is, that's when we start to see the identification of being African as being imposed on us, and then we take it upon ourselves. As a Gambian personally as well, for example, the Senegambia region is somewhere that we all speak the same languages, we all have the same culture, we all kind of look the same, and we are the same people essentially. But because the French took Gambia and the British took Senegal, we have this distinction in our heads now after colonization of, I'm Gambian, this person's Senegalese. But if I trace my family back 6 generations, we were Senegalese. And I have cousins that live in Senegal that are Senegalese, but their mum is from Gambia. Do you know what I mean? And so even with race, I think it's a similar concept. There are people who are racialized as black that weren't considered black. There are people who are considered black that wouldn't consider themselves black in different contexts. Like one of the people quoted in the book, I think it was Ahmed Baba. Was it Ahmed Baba? He was from a tribe called the Sanhaja Berbers. So he considered himself Berber as opposed to West African populations that of traditional West African ethnic groups that he considered black. But when he emigrated to Marrakesh, to Morocco, because he was dark-skinned and he came from West Africa, he was racialized as being black in Moroccan society as opposed to Moroccans. But then when Moroccans traveled to Europe in the Middle Ages, they're racialized as being Moors and are grouped together with black people because they're all darker skinned and they're all Muslim. So it changes according to society, according to power dynamics, and it's not essentially a real thing.
Yeah, I think it's very important that, I also appreciate what you said, but it's very important to remember that how power functions. So why is it that in the late 19th century, Italians get lynched in America? There's lynchings of Italians. They're definitely not white, right? Irish, not white. Why is it that all these groups start getting acknowledged as white? When? In the 1920s and 30s, all these black Americans who don't want to live in Jim Crow South start what's called the Great Migration. They go north to cities like Boston, Chicago, New York, right? Suddenly, there's all these black people around. And then the Anglo-Saxons are like, okay, you guys are all white. We're all white now, right? And because there's the other that they're really afraid of. Why did political blackness fail in the UK? Literally, it was a movement called political blackness. Why did political blackness fail in South Africa? Why did most of the Indians, the majority of the Muslim community even, side with the apartheid regime? Because those in power know how to divide and conquer. They say, oh, well, yeah, okay, you guys want to have this, you guys all want to be black, okay? Well, hey, Indians, you're not really black. Why don't you, we'll get you your own university. You can go to these places. Black people can't go here. And suddenly some of them are like, this isn't that bad a deal. So you start to fragment the solidarity. This is why there's a school of thought called Afro-pessimism. I discuss this in my book. But one of the Afro-pessimist ideas is this idea of kind of blackness, political blackness, solidarity it's basically anti-blackness. Why? Because in the end of the day, all these other groups, they're going to leave. They're going to get accepted. They're going to get, their door prize and be happy. And they're all going to be standing on top of the floor of humanity, which is blackness. Like the thing that allows people to be alive and social and real, which is there's always this other at the bottom, which are racialized black bodies. So, we have to be careful, because if we start talking about sort of solidarity, it's a great idea, and I agree with you, but it's also something that has consistently been fractured and has failed when people allow themselves to be bought off, basically, by those in power.
Thank you. So next, do you want to?
Yeah, just a comment and a question. The one about the Indians in South Africa, I mentioned this on Friday as well. But it's referred to actually the whole Southeast Asian community, not only South Africa, but a lot of other African countries where they've kind of enjoyed a lot of economic, benefits over the black communities. And it still is continuing today as well. A lot of investment still goes, the new mosques and that are still going to predominantly Southeast Asian communities, black communities. And they still, and it's got to a point where black Muslims feel so marginalized that they've created their own Black Muslim Congress of South Africa, which they've had about 3 conferences so far in it. So, but there was just a point. A question was around how do we approach text of sort of ancient Muslims, not ancient, but the older Muslim scholars like Ibn Khaldun, and that way, a lot of their works are used, in modern day sciences and that, but when their comments about, blacks and Africans are, could be found in modern day racist texts as well. So how do we approach that? And, yeah.
Good question.
Go ahead.
So I think, as far as I know, we're kind of maybe unfairly criticizing Ibn Khaldun here, because sometimes people will say, it's like, oh, look, this Muslim geographer, historian says that they're these black people and they're like animals and they're like pagans, they're naked, they're like cannibals, and that seems really racist. But they're not talking about black people, and again, we just assume they're talking about black Africans, like everybody, but they're talking about non-Muslims. So if there's like a black African tribe, let's say Hausa or Fulani, right, and they're Muslim, they're not included in that group. You'll see people like Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Majid, Dimashqi, Al-Umari, all these great Muslim geographers and historians and sociologists will say, like, these people, their rulers are extremely just, they're extremely wealthy, they're very good at they're extremely fastidious about their prayers and Jummah prayer, they're obsessed with memorization of the Quran, all this stuff. And then they'll say, and then to the south, there are these like black people that are more like animals than human beings, and they're pagans, they're cannibals, they're naked. And then we're like, oh, that's so racist. We forget that we just read descriptions of all these people that are literally this, maybe even the same ethnicity, because they're non-Muslim Fulani and they're Muslim Fulani. There's, especially as these groups become Muslim, they basically get brought up into the world of like human beings, who are described as like, oh, these are great societies, and they have, their good sides and their bad sides. It's always the people beyond the boundaries, outside the abode of Islam, who are described in these ways that we today kind of register as very racist. So we shouldn't read these as like descriptions or condemnations of all black Africans. They're very specifically of pagan groups.
Is that a comment to that, or is that a different question?
It's just a question that kind of like wraps everything up. Like, the question, quite a large question. So I think when you look at the conception of your book, Professor, it seems like these black scholars who made these claims about Islam being anti-black, they're speaking from a place of defense. Pan-Africanism, Afro-pessimism, it seems to be a reactionary movement. So when we look at examples of coalitions being formed between different groups, as you said, they all fell. The Rainbow Coalition in Chicago between the Black Panthers, the American homosexuals and the Mexicans seemed to fall and fall apart as soon as Fred Hampton was assassinated. So I ask you, this is my question. Does Islam in this day and age still hold the transformative power that it did when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the message to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because it seems like we're working from, like this brother said, we're working from scientific racism, where we have eugenics being found in every single discourse spoken about when we speak about race, but it's implicit now. So when you hear about black people dominating the NBA, dominating sports, they can jump higher, run faster because of fast twitch fiber muscles. We're missing almost, you know, if you look at the Japanese 100-meter sprint team, they came fourth in the Olympics. We don't look at their race as being a reason as to why they're so fast. So we've got implicit racism, and racism changes in form. So accepting that reality, does Islam hold the same transformative power, or do we as black people need to find safety in Afro-pessimism, in Pan-Africanism, because we as black people created these fields and we find safety within them, because black is not pejorative in these spaces. We will not be stepped on or trampled upon by anyone else, because we understand and legitimize ourselves through ourselves. I'm sorry, it's a long question. But just like you said, Professor,
Interesting.
I think that's really what you said as well. To make a comment is really problematic, because if you look at the concept of intersectionality, at this day and age, I feel like I'm black more than I'm Muslim, because those same black house people that you just mentioned, the only distinguishing quality I have from them is that I'm Muslim. So Ibn Khaldun will say, Muhammad, you're Muslim, mashallah, you're so this, you're so that. But my house brother over there who's non-Muslim, by virtue of him being polytheism, the true concept of black now comes forth. So would Ibn Khaldun say the same thing about me if I was non-Muslim? You know, I don't know.
Do you want to go in and out? Because I think you said you want to go in and out. No,
Go on.
Yeah, just there are two questions. For me, reading Ibn Khaldun's works were troubling. And what I noticed from a number of the scholars is one of either two approaches in terms of dealing with black racism. It's either one, you could say it's the internalizing contempt model, and the other is a resistance model. And the internalizing contempt model, I will kind of describe that where you kind of internalize these kind of so-called prejudices, or these so-called like black people being somewhat inferior, but then you say, oh, mashallah, but they're still a Muslim, or things like someone's pretty for a dark-skinned girl, or like what Mustafa Briggs was saying, that even though you're black, you're still intelligent, or mashallah, you was able to write this book. So that's kind of a defense that I saw from some Muslim scholars and even Muslim speakers today, in terms of trying to defend this kind of rhetoric. And then you've got some other scholars, like Jahid, who was for me very inspirational. He was very unapologetic. Some people say he went over the line, but he wasn't trying to seek validation, approval from even his other Muslim, Arabs, Persians, and what have you. And that's kind of what inspires me, and that's kind of like where I see what the brother was saying, my blackness and me still being a Muslim. So again, it's whatever works for you, because I look at it like I do not need, even though Ibn Khaldun is a respected scholar, may Allah have mercy upon him and elevate his rank in paradise, inshallah. Anything that anyone says, other than the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if it doesn't go in line with what the Quran and the Prophet said, you can ignore it. So I don't need to like seek approval from every single statement that a scholar said. So that's how I look at it. But I think as Muslims, sometimes we look at scholars as if they're somewhat infallible, but they're human beings. They're products of their environment. Some of the things that they say, some what scholars have said, not only about black people, about women, is horrific. I'm not going to try and justify it or say it's this and that. No, it's wrong, and I don't agree with it. I can maybe try and rationalize it and understand where the person was coming from, but I'm not going to wait for this person to kind of like see my humanity. And I'll go with people, listen to people, kind of make me feel human and acknowledge my culture, acknowledge my race, and then obviously then you've got the Messenger of Allah who inshallah is obviously going to transform you. So when you're saying is Islam a transformative religion, if you are reading the Quran, you are reading the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the early companions, it will transform your life. That's my personal belief. Now if you're looking for guidance from those who maybe look at you as less than, then you might find it quite difficult. That's kind of my personal perspective on it.
Yeah, my perspective on it as well is that when we speak about Islam, we like to kind of conceptualize Islam as this institution that has always existed in the same form and the same way from the beginning of the religion until today. And we do know that the Prophet ﷺ was given the complete religion. Allah tells us that he has completed the deen for us and made it, but the way that that deen manifests itself in different times and different places changes. There's an aspect of the deen that's thabit, that is stable and it doesn't change. Then there's an aspect of the deen that is constantly reinterpreted over time for different situations and different ages. And that is the secret in why the Prophet ﷺ was given the final religion, because it's a religion that's adaptable to every time and place, not that it stays the same in every time and place. So, for example, when we speak about Islam in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there's no books of hadith. There's not even a book of the Quran. There's no book that you can gather together in your hands and say, this is the Quran. They only had the Prophet ﷺ. And the Quran came through him. He was reciting words, that's what they knew was Quran. He was speaking to people, that's what they knew as hadith. He was telling people, do this and don't do this, that's what they knew as fiqh. But when the Prophet ﷺ is no longer there, it was up to the people now to say, okay, well, how do we preserve the command of Allah to obey him and his messenger? How do we preserve the Quran and differentiate it from the speech of the Prophet ﷺ? That's when you start to see scholars develop the science of hadith, develop the science of Quran and tajweed, develop the science of Aqidah. Aqidah, even, everybody talks about Aqidah. It's so important to know Aqidah. The word Aqidah was never mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ. But when we have interaction with the Eastern Roman Empire and different philosophies and different ways of thinking and Greek philosophy, people had to say, well, the Greeks classify being as this. They classify human nature as this. They classify divine nature as this. As Muslims, what is our response from the Quran and the Sunnah? That's when the scholars now start to develop ilm al-kalam, the science of speaking about these realities, and then they develop aqidah to preserve the spirit of the Quran and the Sunnah. And so, as every age appears with its own challenges and its own rhetoric and its own phenomenon that need to be addressed from the spirit of the Quran and the Sunnah. So I would say Islam does still have that transformative power if there are scholars and people who are willing to engage with the Quran and the Sunnah and manifest it in a way that approaches the phenomenon of the time and interacts with the phenomenon of the time in the spirit of the Prophet ﷺ, which is why we have a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says at the beginning of every qarn, every age, Allah will send someone to renew the religion. It's not that the religion has changed or needs to be changed, but it's that the society has changed. And so it needs to have a renewed interpretation for the age, the day and age that we live in and the unique challenges that we're facing. So for example, you can't go to a 14th century scholar for answers about how to interact with artificial intelligence and AI because it didn't exist. They don't even have a concept of that. You can't go to a 16th century scholar and talk about marrying someone over FaceTime and having a fatwa for that. You need someone that's in your time who understands the phenomenon of the time, understands what's going on, understands the conditions that people find themselves in, and then can go to the Quran, go to the Sunnah, and find answers and solutions and a manifestation of Islam that doesn't stray from the religion, but fits into the religion. And that's why when we look at the ahadith about bid'ah as well, it's very interesting because there are people, certain groups within Islam who always constantly attack bid'ah, but they don't ever talk about the fact that the Quran itself in a book is a bid'ah. Praying on prayer mat, having rugs in the masjid is a bid'ah. Using a microphone to give a khutbah is a bid'ah. So they differentiate between different types of bid'ah as this is a good bid'ah and this is a bad bid'ah, if they realize it or if they don't. So when the Prophet ﷺ says, whoever innovates something into the religion, people don't complete the hadith. He says, whoever innovates something into the religion that is not of it will have it rejected. But it's up to the scholars, the people of knowledge, and they exist in every age and they'll always exist in every time. And the Prophet ﷺ guaranteed that there will always be people of guidance in his ummah who can, not to say reinterpret the religion, but manifest the religion in a way that deals with the problems of the era. So it is transformative if we use it in the way that it's supposed to be used.
Professor Brown?
I mean, I'm not really qualified to answer this question. I'm like an egghead. If I even go to protest, the second like anyone like blows a whistle or something, I'm like, gotta get out of here. So I'm not like a good authority on these things. But I mean, Islam is transformative to me. I mean, and you know, when you said like that, the difference between you and your house of brothers, the only difference is you're Muslim. That's like a big deal. I mean, that means a lot, and it meant a lot to someone like Ibn Khaldun. So they also didn't know anything beyond the boundaries of their world, you know. So that's why they're dismissive. I mean, I think if he had like more exposure to them, he wouldn't say these kind of things. But I think that's just like, you know, it's like the medieval world where they think like there's like sea monsters out in the ocean. They just don't know what's going on there.
Okay, the next is anyone else?
Can I just answer that? There's a group in Chicago called Iman Central. That's worth looking at if you were thinking about Islam as a uniting factor. If you're thinking about like what role faith has today, bringing people together, I think that would be an interesting example to look at.
Thank you.
Iman, Inner City Muslim Action Network, I think. Iman,
Okay.
yeah.
So the next question, what is the perfect starter pack for those who want to learn more about Blackness and Islam?
We've got it right here.
No, it's I would get
On a serious note,
and Habeeb Akande's Illuminating the Blackness.
No, on a serious note, these two books accomplished what I intended, but they've done it because I kind of wanted to look at what Dr. Brown was asking about, is Islam an anti-black religion, which he comprehensively has done, and then also I wanted to cite some inspirational figures from our past and contemporary history in terms of kind of like inspire people, men and women alike. And that's what Mustafa Briggs has done. So that's why I definitely would recommend these two books in terms of like a starter pack. If you want another quick recommendation, Dr. Sherman Jackson's got a brilliant book, Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering. So it's very academic and it's not as easy to read like Dr. Brown's book, but in terms of like looking at the kind of idea that God or Allah supports black oppression, he is a very, very brilliant book that I definitely recommend.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, add to that, yeah.
So in this book, the Islam and Blackness book by Professor Brown, he does have an extensive list of all the other books that deal with this topic, traditional books and modern books. So he highlights all of the books that have been written in Arabic by traditional Islamic scholars, and then he talks about more contemporary books like my book, like Habeeb Akande's book, like many of the other scholars. So you do have like a very extensive list here. So if you do grab this one, from this one you can then branch to all the other ones and kind of create your starter pack and get Beyond Bilal. Yeah.
The next question someone asked was, are there any writings on Islam and Blackness in the Ottoman context? Ibn al-Jawzi is Abbasid, al-Suyuti is Mamluk. Did this impact their incentive to write? So the person's asking, are there any writings on Islam and Blackness in the Ottoman context? You actually did reference one.
Yeah, I haven't come across any, maybe, Professor.
I mean, so Ottoman, by Ottoman do you mean like metropolitan Ottoman Istanbul, kind of Balkans area?
There is, sorry.
Go ahead, yeah.
There's a book I came across a couple of weeks ago. It's called Dispelling the Darkness. Forgive me if anyone speaks Turkish, but I'm going to butcher this word. The Halberdi's Treaty, a comparative look at Black African in Ottoman letters in the early modern period. And there's a couple of videos actually on YouTube by, I need to see his name, I'm not pronouncing it properly.
Send me that.
Tezcan.
Mm-hmm.
Becky
Tezcan.
Becky Tezcan, yeah. He's got a couple of really good videos on YouTube, and ultimately he's looking at some books that are written by, I think, Mullah Ali, and you mentioned it in your book. So Mullah Ali, he wrote a book similar to Mustafa Briggs' book, like The Virtues of Black People in Islam. And basically his book is a translation of an early book in Arabic, but he was writing for a Ottoman Turkish that context. So he's Becky Tezcan has got some useful videos on YouTube, and like I said, he's got a book, Dispelling the Darkness, which you can check out. Is there anyone else that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's also, if you're talking about kind of the Ottoman metropolitan, Istanbul, Constantinople, I think that's probably the best one. But remember, the Ottoman Empire is, really big. So there's a lot of books were written by, a lot of the books that I mentioned are written during the Ottoman period by Ottoman scholars. in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, 20th century in Egypt, in the Hijaz, which are at that time all, Ottoman areas.
And there's actually another, it's not a book, I forgot, but the Ilm Studios or Ilm Films, ILM Film Studio. They've got a YouTube page, they've got like a lot of, what's it called again? I don't want to butcher their name again, I'm doing a disastrous job right here.
You need to take Turkish lessons, isn't it?
No, I did say Turkish. Ilm Films, ILM, FILM, it's a YouTube page, Islamic YouTube page. They talk about blackness within the context not only of the Ottoman period but different periods. Definitely should check them out. Yeah. Any other questions before? Yeah.
Right.
My question's for Jack.
Yeah, that's me. That's what people call me. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and also I've been to to your talks in recent days. And I see mainly all is brown faces, Muslim faces. Alhamdulillah, and you've got quite good reception from the people, inshallah. So I'm wondering, are you interested in taking it to non-Muslim, Caucasian or white people, your findings and your message, and if so, what changes you would make to the presentation to draw them in? Because I'm not a student at this university, but I'm assuming it's open to all people. I don't see many white reverts here or white faces here. Given that there are quite a few reverts in London, etc. So back to my question, what change did you make in order to address the non-Muslim white society at large, or are you comfortable, happy to just leave your findings within the Muslim community, which maybe in this country have brown faces or black faces?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, so one of my students who graduated is supposed to come, and he's white. But he didn't show up. He said he wanted to make sure there's one white person here. He's not here. I don't have to talk to him about this, but I don't know. I mean, I actually didn't know what to expect in the audiences here. I thought I was going to get yelled at more, so I'm honestly so far pretty happy. But I don't know. I think. So I don't know. My experience with white people in America is either they don't know about this stuff, or they're actually racist, or they feel really bad about, they feel kind of really guilty being white, and they sometimes beat themselves up maybe too much about that. But I don't know. I think it's just. So I don't know. I mean, if they're interested, I'm always happy to talk to anybody about this subject. But I mean, I think that. I mean, it's a slightly different question, but it comes to mind as being important. I've been treated. I've traveled throughout the Muslim world, and I get treated like royalty. And it really breaks my heart. When I see. I remember one time I was in this scholarly event, and there was this really famous scholar from Syria, and he was sitting up on the, in the front of the room, and there's all these scholars, young scholars, and I was one of them, and this one guy who's way more knowledgeable than me, had spent so long studying in Syria, probably always wanted to meet this scholar who's up there on stage, and then they just picked me and put me up next to the scholar, and then I looked in the audience, and he didn't look at me. The guy, my friend, didn't look at me in a bad way. It wasn't he was, but it just felt so bad. There was he really should have been up there. And I feel bad that, someone could say, oh well, it's important because you know how to communicate to white people or something. But at the same time, I feel really lousy that people who are, I go to Muslim countries or something and I get treated better than people who really deserve to be treated better than me.
Any other questions? Yeah, sure, go.
What did I do? I mean, at the time I was, you know, like, I don't know, 25 years old. I was like terrified, and I just sat there. I mean, now, it's actually an interesting question, right? I mean, because let's say I'm like, you know, you really should bring up this other guy. Then what if that's like really embarrassing for everybody who's organized it or something? I don't know. Maybe that was the right thing to do. I don't know. I'm not sure. Like I would have liked, but then what? I don't know. I'm not sure what. But what happens if my friend actually, you know, like dropped a bag of dog poop on this guy's porch or something once, and he doesn't like him? I have no idea. Like, you know, I just don't know what are all the conceivable possibilities. But so I don't know. But I mean, that's an interesting question. I think today I try to bring this up. Like I try to always make sure that, you know, if I'm being invited somewhere, that it's either like because I actually am the best person to do that, or if not, then I really encourage the people to bring others who wouldn't get the same attention.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions before we wrap up, but if we can try and keep our answers quite brief. How do we give blackness its own merit whilst also recognizing its nuance? What marks out someone as black is not solely tied to skin color. So,
if a brief answer from me would be literally blackness is whatever the culture or the society that you're in or you're engaging with defines it as. And so it is very nuanced because there's no strict definition of it. It's something that, you know, changes from society to society, from place to place. So you just have to look at the context in which you're in. What does it mean to be black in that society? Who is racialized as black as who isn't? Like, I remember I had an interesting debate with my sister-in-law. So my wife is half African-American and Native American. Her father's like mixed African-American and Native American. And then her mother is mixed white and Mexican. So she looks very light-skinned. She could pass as Arab. She's like racially ambiguous. And so is her sister. So I was talking to her sister one day about something. And she said to me, yeah, but you know, you won't understand because you're not black. And I looked at her, I'm like, what do you mean I'm not black? I'm blacker than you. And she said, no, you're African. It's different. Where I come from, if you're black, you're descended from African Americans who were enslaved, and even if you're one drop, you're still black. It's like, so I'm black, you're not black. Which flipped my whole perception of what it means to be black, but in her context, that's what being black meant, and I wasn't a part of that. Whereas in my context, growing up in England, I'm black and she's mixed, or she's a lighty, or she's whatever, do you know what I mean? So it's like, you have to look at who you're engaging with, what society you're engaging with, what their paradigms are, and then kind of go off that.
thank you. Professor Brown, anything to add? I think you kind of spoke about it at the beginning when you read your passage from the book. Next question. What are your opinions of monotheism being a source of unification between races? Is this notion valid?
Yes, it's valid. I think it's valid.
It should be. That's my brief answer.
The next question is well, this is probably for the organisers. Is this session going to be recorded? Probably.
Was it recorded? Yeah. Will it be made available? That's the question.
Okay, I think. Any more questions from Ireland bunch, aren't you? Any more questions? Okay, I think we can wrap it up.
Oh, there's one on the screen.
We can't answer. Okay, so this question, I think we did speak about this. What is the Islamic position on reparations, if any? Thank you.
I don't think we have the, we don't have the answer.
I know that this is interesting. I'm actually working on an article on this. Because it's really, it's really bizarre, right? So I know how to do reparations for Muslim slavery. Go to Egypt and Syria and Tunisia and Jordan and Turkey. Find the lightest skinned people you can and give them a bunch of money.
Explain, give them
Yeah,
context
oh, yeah,
before
so
you get
probably-
cancelled.
I mean, explain.
The
Let me
Twitterati
explain.
are waiting.
So the elites of the Ottoman Empire really going, in some parts going back to the 1500s, but definitely, especially in the Mediterranean area, like 1700s, 1800s. Their moms, the mothers are Circassian concubines.
Explain what Circassian.
They're people from the Caucasus. So they're all Circassian, Georgian. They're actually literally Caucasian, okay? They're literally Caucasian. And those, so, you ever wondered why, like, the elite people in Egypt or Jordan or Syria, they're all like, they're really light skinned, they have, straight hair, they don't look that Arab? That's because their multiple generations of their mothers are slave concubines.
From Europe.
From the essentially southern Russia, Caucasus area. Or maybe also Greek, maybe Slavic. So that's a good way to get people who are descendants of slaves. Yeah. But the reason I bring that up is it's kind of like ironic, right? Which is that it's a really different situation than the Americas, very different situation. So I think you have to think about reparations very differently from the very beginning.
And it also plays into the debate and the illumination that needs to be brought to the fact that slavery in the Islamic world wasn't specifically racialized towards black people. There were a higher amount or just as much an equal amount. So in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, for example, we have instances of African slaves, people who were enslaved, such as Bilal and his mother, etc. But the majority of the slaves in the Arabian Peninsula were other Arabs that were captured in war and enslaved by fellow Arabs. Then when we see the expansion of the Islamic Empire and the, Sayyidina Umar bin al-Khattab, etc., into the Eastern Roman Empire and into the Persian Empire, many of the people that are enslaved are in fact Romans and Persians. So we see, for example, even Imam Zayn al-Abidin, who's the son of Imam al-Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ. His mother was reported to have been a princess from Persia. But when the Persian Empire was defeated, she was captured, enslaved. He purchased her, he freed her, and he married her. And that was a tradition in slavery. And if we look in the Abbasid period and in the Ottoman period, many of the rulers, many of the elite people were people who their fathers were wealthy Arabs or wealthy people in society who had these children with enslaved European women and enslaved white women. And that's why the kids ended up getting lighter and lighter, because, as he said, it was generations of them getting a slave from Russia or a slave from Eastern Europe or a slave from this place or that place, having children with them and then continuing. So slavery wasn't racialized in the same way that it was in the States, in the Muslim world. It was equal opportunity slavery.
Yeah. Final, very quick question. Again, just for the benefit of anyone who's joined late. So Islam and Blackness and Beyond Bilal are available outside the store. Yes, I definitely recommend each and every one of you buy 2 copies for yourself.
And we can sign them, right?
Oh yeah.
I've been signing a lot of books lately.
Yeah, so you can sign them at £5 and I'll be donated. Well, the series, yeah, definitely highly recommend that each and every one of you try and purchase 1 or 2 copies. And just a last question before I bring up Prof. Ahmed. How can we eradicate anti-Blackness other than purchasing your book? What advice would you give?
Miscegenation.
Miscegenation.
Yes, we need to we need to have intermarriage. That's my. Well, first of all, mosques need to partner. So the rich Desi Mosque needs to partner with in America the Black Mosque, and they need to have barbecues and stuff together, and they hang out. Their kids get to know each other. They get married. Racial problem solved.
You said other than purchase Beyond Bilal.
Yeah,
other than purchasing the book, read it and purchase it for other people and just pass it on, inshallah. That's my solution.
He's a real West African self. Okay,
I'm evil, you know.
Prof. Ahmed, closing thoughts, please.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. I've got a bit of a sore throat, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me. So as Habib mentioned, please purchase the books from outside. They are discounted today, and obviously you've got the benefit of the speakers here. Ustadh Mustafa Briggs doesn't live in the UK anymore, he lives in the States, and so does Brian as well.
I live in
Egypt. Time to
Egypt.
kind of get the book signed and ask a few questions directly to them. And I'm going to emphasize on buying the books from here and not from Amazon. For various reasons, Amazon has ethical issues. But by buying the books, purchasing books from the IHRC bookstore, you benefit not only us, but also the speakers, so that you support them to make this a full-time profession, so that they can teach us and also write books on the topic continuously. So I wanted to talk about on topic of racism. A couple of days ago, there was some protests organized by the far right at some asylum venue where there were violence. And we've all seen the rise of far right across the world, whether it's in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, and wherever it may be, you see like hate and racism on the rise. And I wanted to kind of highlight the work that we do at the Islamic Human Rights Commission. There's a couple of people in the room here who are trained immigration solicitors who specialize in supporting individuals who have a precarious immigration status to become regularized in the UK. Now imagine a world, these three speakers, these ustadhs, our teachers, were forced to migrate. May Allah preserve them and may Allah protect them from such a situation. But imagine some sort of natural disaster or a famine or a conflict has erupted and they had to relocate. And the new place they've gone to, they were forced to not teach, not write, not lecture at universities, but to become a cleaner, not be able to produce the works they're producing now. And the work that we've done at the Islamic Human Rights Commission, we've seen how many people, countless people come to us with qualifications such as doctors and lawyers and engineers who are here in the UK, and because of the immigration status, they're not able to apply their skills to this country. There's a case that I want to talk about, a story that has touched me ever since I've come across this brother. And I think truly, if I've ever met a wali of Allah, this guy is a wali of Allah. And I'll tell you why. This brother was introduced to us. He has a large family from Indonesia, struggling with finances. And I was doing some research for UCL on food poverty in the UK. And I was interviewing his family. And at the time, his wife had given birth, lost a child. And so we got talking. And I asked the brother, so tell me about your situation with food poverty. He goes, I am not allowed to work. Because of my immigration status, I don't get a job anywhere. And the situation has come that when my wife was pregnant, she was so malnourished. The lack of iron in the system has meant that she miscarried the child, but also her strength in her body has so diminished that she was bedridden for months. For months, because they weren't able to afford red meat or anything that's high in iron. And that made me think about the time of Umar ibn Khattab, when there was a famine and where people had come to Medina because there was no food. And Umar ibn Khattab said that because of the poverty that people who have come to my city, I will stop eating meat myself. And it was reported that Umar ibn Khattab's skin color had changed because of the lack of meat and iron in the system. And he goes on to tell me, this brother, that the accommodation that he was staying at, he was subletting illegally so that he can make some money out of it, and he's got a roof over his head. And the local masjid that he goes to, there was one brother who was distressed in the corner. So he got talking to him and asked him, brother, how can I help you? He realized that this brother's a British citizen, out of a job, and for some reason or another, he's going to get kicked out of his house by his family. He said, brother, don't worry, I'll help you. So literally, a couple of days, he went down the streets, found bits and pieces of items that he could find in alleyways, and he actually hand-built a shed in his garden. And I sat in that shed where I was interviewing him for the research. And that shed was fully equipped with heating and electricity, and it was comfortable. So he moved this brother into his house. He was giving him shelter. He was giving him his food. Now when I asked him what food you were eating, he said the children that were eating the food were rice and maybe some curry to go with it. I said, what did you eat? He said that anything that was left over we would eat. Sometimes we'd eat nothing. We'd skip meals. We'd literally skip meals. I said, and then he said that I always used to leave a portion for this brother who's living in the shed. And this brother used to preach to him saying that, brother, you don't work hard enough. You should go and get a job. You should take care of your family. And this brother didn't say a single word to him. Despite his circumstances, he accommodated this brother, gave his food that he should have given to his wife so that she can recover and regain her strength. I can go on about this brother. Truly, I think this guy is the wali of Allah because of this one incident he tells me about. He said that one of his eldest son, who studied in the madrasa in Darul Uloom up north, because he couldn't afford to keep the son at home, he was going to the madrasa, and the university or the college or the madrasa was asking him for the fees, and he just couldn't afford it. And it had got to a point where the madrasa had said, look, we have gone beyond our patience, so we have to kind of reject this boy who's becoming a scholar of Islam, but we can't afford to keep him and you can't afford to pay for him. So him and his wife said, oh, let's make dua to Allah. And literally they were both turned and were making dua to Allah. And then a few minutes later, on top of the wardrobe, they saw something glittering. And they realized there was some jewelry that was given to him. It was imitation jewelry that was given by the next door neighbor. And he said, look, my wife's just passed away and I've got no use of these items. Please take it, your children will play with it. So he thought nothing of it. He put it away in the corner until this moment when he realized he got some imitation jewelry. So he calls the brother up and said, can you go to a local shop where you can get some money out of it? He's too afraid to go out and about because he fears that he might get caught by the police or authorities and be sent away, and then his wife and his children will be left destitute. So this brother goes to the shop, to the pawn shop, and found out that they're actual gold. They were actual gold. He ended up getting £3,500 for it. £3,500. So he comes back and he said, look, I was about to say his name. He said, I've just found, this is real gold. And Allah's answered your du'as. I've got 3,500. He said, I just need £2,000 for the fees for this madrasa. The remaining you can take because you've been trying to raise funds so they can give dawah in certain country, because he was a Tablighi brother. He wasn't even greedy for the money. And the reality is that we have seen so many people come to us in such destitution that they are not able to regularize the status because they don't have the funds, they don't have the expertise, and in most cases they are exploited. They'll go to dodgy solicitors and they will exploit them. And I am not making this up. I am not making this up. I have had sisters come to me and said that these solicitors were charging me extortionate fees. The only way I could pay for it was by selling myself. Not making this up. Not making this up. And these sisters were going from mosque to mosque, from mosque to mosque, asking for support and being turned away. Literally being turned away. And most mosques in this country don't even accommodate Muslim prayer facilities for our sisters. Imagine if that was your sister or your daughter or your mother or your grandmother. And so please, if you visit our website, you can see the work that we do when it comes to racism and immigration work that we do. And when I was sitting here right at the front, I saw these pillars here. And I was doing some research for IHRC in Mexico. I was looking at the migration crisis. And the person that took me to this place, they said there's a train that travels all the way through Mexico into America. It's called the Monster. It's a massive train that takes passengers and goods and whatnot. And many of the migrants jump on this train so that they can get a free ride across Mexico. But there's some spots where they can jump off, get some food, and then try and jump on the next train. But what the authorities had done, at spots where these individuals were jumping off, they had built pillars like this, so that what happens is that when they try and jump off, they get hit on the pillar. So many out of desperation have to get off the train, end up falling onto these pillars, breaking their arm, dying, children dying, sometimes children left behind on trains, fathers and mothers separated, husband and wife separated, etc., etc. This hate goes on and on and on, and it's created a reality where we just ignore the plight of migrants and migrants from Muslim communities, especially the sisters who are having to sell themselves. And there are brothers and sisters who have worked with us, who have come across these case studies. These aren't seldom cases. These are common cases that we're having to deal with. So please, brothers and sisters, we take your zakat and sadaqah. I'm not asking for giving you, for you to give your funds to us today. I've just come here to raise awareness of the work Islamic Human Rights Commission does. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah.